The mentor's idea was, in order to create community, you have to first have a disaster, because that's what brings people together.
At some point, I remember thinking that my car was just up ahead, and then everything kind of opened up into a clearing, and around that clearing, as far as I could see, were trees, and that was when it really hit me that I was lost.
In order to put anything new into the world, we have to go to those places that are at the edges of what we know. They're not safe places, and those are highly vulnerable places.
This story is about the things bodies say, the things bodies do. Broken bodies, mended bodies, different bodies, reimagined bodies, and bodies that, despite what the world tells us, are exactly what they need to be. I'm Carmel Michael, and this is Hyacinth Podcast, where I combine scholarly research with the work of writers and artists to ponder beauty, anger, love, loss, fear, glory, and the unbreakable heart of human living. In this episode, we discuss what disability and accessibility really means. With arts-based researcher Dr. Carla Rice, we discover how changing the ways we think about difference has the potential to truly change our world. Circus artist and teacher Erin shares the incredible story of how she brought herself back to life after a life-altering trauma and found new purpose in the disability world. We also hear from Vanessa Furlong, who collaborates with Erin on a project called Legacy Circus, with a mission to make circus practice and performance more accessible to people with all types of bodies and minds. In the fall of 2019, I visited Erin at the studio where she practices and teaches. We sat down together on a small couch at the front of the studio, and while several students practiced on the silks behind us, she shared her story with me.
Hi, my name is Erin Ball. I am a circus artist and coach, and I run Kingston Circus Arts in Kingston, Ontario, and I'm also the co-founder of Legacy Circus, and I'm a double below knee amputee. I've been doing circus for, I always get confused with time, but I would say somewhere between 11 and 12-ish years. I discovered it, I was just knew that was what I wanted to do. And so I started training and eventually started teaching and performing. And in 2014, I was performing and teaching, and that was pretty much my life. And I went for a walk in the woods. It was March, so it was like icy and puddles under the ice. And so my feet got wet, and I didn't realize how quickly when moisture is involved that frostbite could happen. So I sat down for a while, and when I went to get up, I couldn't feel my feet. And I thought I could just crawl back to my car, but I got really turned around, and at some point I remember thinking that my car was just up ahead, and then everything kind of opened up into a clearing, and around that clearing, as far as I could see, were trees, and that was when it really hit me that I was lost. And I started screaming for help, and of course nobody came. And I really just have flashes from maybe like the first day or two, maybe 3, I really don't know. Time is kind of funny out there. And the next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital. I was really confused, and I was told that I was out there for 6 days. I was found by a police dog. I was unconscious. My body temperature was 19 degrees Celsius. So when they fire rescue crew came and brought me to an area where a helicopter could land, and then they flew me to the hospital, and they opened up my chest and rewarmed my body slowly and kept me unconscious for a few days. And then when I did wake up, I remember hearing, "We're not going to show her feet just yet." I didn't recognize my body at all. And then eventually at some point later, I saw my feet, and I was in quite a lot of denial about that. And I mean, the next 11 months of my life, when I think about it now, it's pretty surreal. There was a lot of not knowing what was going on. People were saying, your feet need to come off. And I was like, what do you mean? And June of that year, it was pretty clear. My feet had turned black and they were starting to come off themselves. And my mental state, I was very disconnected. I was in a psychosis. And yeah, with help from my family, it was decided that it was time, and I had surgery. And then I think that kind of snapped me into things. I remember the bandages and looking down at my legs, and then it was whoa, this is real. And then I went into a really deep depression because it was my whole life was movement and circus, and what was I going to do now? I mean, I definitely wanted to die. I came very close to dying. There were many things that happened. Hospital system, I mean, that's a whole other story. But the biggest thing that I took from that was hospitals are not a place that are set up for people to grieve and to heal. And for a while, they were giving me very invasive treatments that really did a number on me. And I mean, that was 11 months for me. And it just got to be too much. And the only thing that I knew how to do was move. And so at this point, I was locked up on the mental health floor, and I asked some other patients if they would want to do some acrobatics with me. And we started doing some partner and group acrobatics. And I don't know, I just started to get a new motivation, I guess. If I'm going to live, then circus and movement need to be a part of it. And so I took the knowledge that I had gained before, and wearing these prosthetic legs that were heavy and awkward, and the feet don't move, and I'm trying to do these things the way that I used to do them. And at that point, I wasn't ready to kind of show people my legs. And so I would cover my legs with all these pairs of leg warmers, and I was performing again a little bit, but in the middle of the summer, and I'm wearing leg warmers, and my feet aren't moving. And at one show, my dad was there, and he said, "You should take your leg warmers off." And I was like, I don't think I'm ready for that. And I did, and from that moment, I never put them back on, and it was a really big turning point for me. In terms of accepting my new life, I guess, it helped. It actually made me more confident. It really just helped me to accept the situation. And then after that point, I started playing around with circus, taking my prosthetic legs off. I mean, that was another huge breakthrough. And I started realizing that I didn't need to do things the way that I had done them before. So I needed to find different pathways. So I just looked at it as a puzzle of okay, how can I make this work, using different parts? If I need to, I needed to use my feet before, how can I use my inner thighs or my knees? And then I, at some point, had someone come to one of my classes, and she was an amputee. And at first I started trying to work with her the same way that I was teaching everybody else. And it eventually dawned on me, of course it's not working. You need to work with it the same way what you're doing with yourself. And I was going to a lot of coaches to get training, and I was finding a lot of things that weren't working anymore. And so I just started taking some of that knowledge, and then the knowledge, like more amputees and people with different bodies and the disability community were coming to me to learn circus. And at some point along the way, I had also met Vanessa, and she was really interested in doing this work, and we kind of put our heads together and created a method for teaching adaptive circus, guidelines, I guess, for teaching adaptive circus and working with the disability community.
So, wow. so many, there's so many themes that could be talked about in your story, right? I mean, there's grief, there's how the body grieves through movement and what stasis does to not let grief happen. But is there something specific about circus arts that gives something like for people who have bodies that are different, or disabled bodies, or just bodies in pain, or minds in pain? Like, is there something about circus arts that's special for this specific thing?
I think that one thing about circus arts is that it's so diverse. There's so many different disciplines. So I think that people can find something within circus. It's going to be different for everybody, and based on just what they're drawn to and what they like and what their situation and body and mind is. For me, after my accident, I really took to silks. Once I started taking off the prosthetic legs, it just gave me this real sense of freedom. On the ground, they're kind of like awkward and heavy. There's just something really satisfying about hanging on and this freedom of movement in the air. I also think that specifically for the disability community, it's something that for a long time it's kind of, whether it's been actually said, but the undertone is there that it's like for specific bodies that do these specific things. And so I think we've been told for a really long time, like, you can't do this. And so I think the fact that we can is pretty empowering.
I've known Vanessa Furlong for years from living in the Halifax arts and music community. When I launched Hyacinth Podcast last summer, Vanessa was kind enough to be one of my guests at our very first live podcast event. The stories she shared with us then were so moving that I called her again, and she kindly gave me a second interview for this episode.
I am Vanessa Furlong, and I am a circus artist. So Erin and I were selected as part of, I think it was a group of 12 people selected from all over to come in and work under a mentor at something called Circus Sessions that was run by Femme de Feu. And so we went to Toronto. Most of us kind of knew of each other through social media, but many of us had never worked together before. And we had 5 days to work under mentor Adele Nodé-Langlois, and we made a show in 5 days. The mentor's idea was, in order to create community, you have to first have a disaster. You have to have this storm, because that's what brings people together. And so they asked us to bring up our own darknesses. And in that, we discovered who had similar darknesses to each other. And one thing that she pointed out was Erin and I both had what she called weird legs. So I had my stilts, and Erin has prosthetic legs. And so she asked us to get together and see what came of that. And that's how Erin and I started.
Wow, that is an incredibly beautiful idea that kind of like disaster or darkness brings community together. That is an amazing thought. Tell me about your stilts. How did you get to stilt work? And I don't know, what do they feel like for you? Like, why stilts? What do they do for you?
So I first started with stilts just because they were just there and something that I hadn't tried yet. And they were really scary. But I discovered really quickly that I was able to do things on stilts that I hadn't traditionally seen before. I was able to kick high through the air and do cartwheels and do bridges and all these really fun things. And later on, like I'd say like 10 years into them, I realized that, the stilts were this for me, it was me making myself as big as possible. I was able to stand out and be big and all of these things that I have been doing since I was a kid, just making myself big and outrageous.
I saw a YouTube video of you and Erin working together, kind of an early iteration of the show that you put together. And there's this moment where you, as characters on stage, reveal to each other your respective prosthetics, right? You know, Erin reveals that she has prosthetic legs, you reveal your stilts, and there's this amazing connection that happens between you on stage. So I want to talk a little bit about visible versus invisible disabilities and how you negotiate this space with Erin, who has a very visible physical changes to her body, and you who sort of puts on stilts, you who like adds something to your body sort of by choice. How do you negotiate that space?
So that took us a long time to figure out, because when Erin and I did start working together, we had a hard time deciding who was the stilt character to Erin. And each time we tried to add a narrative, we would have a dramaturge or a director or whoever shoot us down and say, no, this isn't about you, Vanessa, this is about Erin. And very true that this particular story that we were telling was about Erin. But the two of us were like, but why do you have these different legs? Why do you have these attachments? And where does that story come from? And how did that bring you to Erin and her story? So we talked about how, I do live with invisible disability and about how people do just assume that I don't have a story there and that I don't fit into that disability world. And so, my stilts, my making myself bigger than I am, my putting on that disguise, that costume, that security, that whatever it is me covering that part up. So when Erin and I sat down and revealed to each other the changes and then took those off, we just sat bare. It was just Erin and it was just Vanessa. That was that was us at our most vulnerable.
Tell me about what diversifying the bodies that we see on stage, like what is the message of adaptive circus? What is the point? What are you trying to do with that?
Well, there's like these two worlds. There's we want to do adaptive circus, and then there's we want to do circus and not have to call it adaptive. It just is. And so we're not quite there yet, but we want to be. So with adaptive, we're just saying, can we change the way we express and tell stories and discover our apparatuses in the air and on the floor based on the person who is doing it at the time, rather than looking at a person who's coming in as a student and defining all of the things that they can't do. Can we start defining all the things that they can do and expand upon that? So it's about inclusion and total inclusion.
And you guys are also doing some amazing work in thinking about not only the people on stage or the performers, you're also thinking about your audience. So maybe tell me a little bit about some of the things that you are exploring recently with making the experience for the audience also much more inclusive.
What we've been trying to do is to make it so that there's the assumption that we will have people want to take in our show that may need to take it in differently and not the traditional way. So we've started working with Alex Ballmer about learning how to do a type of enhanced narration for people with low vision and who are blind. And so rather than a traditional, audio description, it's how can we take the organic sounds and how can we choose words and choose different sound clips and things that will enhance the story for them. And we've also chosen to have relaxed performances, let people know that there may be a loud bang. tone down the lights, tone down the sound, make it safe for people if they need to exclaim, if they need to get up and move around, they can do so. Have touch tours for people who are low vision or blind. They want to feel exactly what it is that they're going to have described to them. So let them feel the costumes and the rigging and the apparatuses and such. Just accessible PDF programming. People want to know who's on the stage and who contributed, and so make it so that everyone can find that out. There's a whole list of things, and we really have barely scratched the surface. But it's just a matter of saying you are welcome to be in this space and take in our show, because with live performances, that's not always the case.
Learning about the work Erin and Vanessa are doing blew my mind wide open. I spent years as a performer and as a concert and event organizer, and outside of the required accessibility standards of a venue, like an automatic door or an accessible bathroom, I just never considered the possibilities of what accessibility might really look like, that it could and should be a form of art in itself. I wanted to learn a lot more about this, like what do the words disability and accessibility really mean? How have our cultures developed these definitions over time?
Okay, so my name is Carla Rice, and I am a professor and a Canada Research Chair at the University of Guelph. And I run a center called the Revision Center for Art and Social Justice. And we work with marginalized and misrepresented communities using arts-informed methods, and especially storytelling, to disrupt dominant narratives and to imagine more just futures.
Yeah, so maybe you could start with describing Project Revision a little bit. If someone has never heard of it, how would you describe the work that you're doing in that project?
At Revision, we engage with a whole range of arts methodologies. We center story in a lot of our arts methods, although not all of them. Storytelling work via video, via audio, story work through digital fiction, creative nonfiction, research-based theater. So we use a whole range of methodologies centering story that are intended to speak back to dominant narratives and dominant discourses about non-normative and marginalized bodies and lives.
If I spoke with someone who wasn't involved in the kind of work that you're doing, and I said, I want to have a discussion about accessibility, and even I kind of would immediately picture we're talking about wheelchair ramps. We have this one version of what that means. Maybe you could just talk about defining the language around disability or accessibility. What are your vision for the ways that we think about those things, who it affects, and what it really means?
Disability. When people hear the word, they imagine a certain body. They often imagine someone who's using a wheelchair. They might imagine someone who's living with a sensory disability. They might imagine a blind person. Maybe they imagine a deaf person. And our approach to disability is we see disability as part of human diversity. And we understand disability to include all bodies that exist outside of what our imagined norm is. So we have an imagined standard of our species. We have an imagined normative notion of what the human is or should be. And that definition of the human has been in development in the social sciences and in the humanities since the Enlightenment. When Leonardo da Vinci created what he called Vitruvius Man. And this was an ideal figure for what a human was. And all bodies that fall outside of that ideal get labeled with different kinds of pathology. We want to make the case that all of the bodily differences and mental differences represent a rich tapestry of what it means to be human. And that disability then and mind-body difference are really at the center of and an integral part of the story of humanity. So we can see disability as this kind of very broad category that's capturing, sort of non-normative lives in many ways. We can include chronic illness in disability or acute illness in disability. We can include mental difference. Anybody who lives with mental distress or a different way of thinking and feeling. We can include facial and physical difference. So anybody who has a body that is perceived as not species typical. And I would also include people who are diagnosed as obese by the medical system, who live in a fat body. And so then accessibility becomes a human question and a human problem to solve. How do we make spaces and environments suitable to different kinds of bodies?
Right. I really enjoyed the parts of your writing where you discuss this idea of vulnerability, how that's involved in this kind of work. And you use the term vulnerable observer or vulnerable researcher. I think you define yourself as that, I think.
Absolutely.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that then, because I think it speaks to the ways that people who aren't considered disabled or needing accessibility in our current world, how the interaction happens. You say that vulnerability is the ground for human exchange, which I think is a beautiful sentence. Maybe let's dig into that a little bit. Like, what does it mean to be a vulnerable observer or researcher in this space? Or maybe, and I'm not sure if this is the right term, an ally? I'm not sure. Maybe we could kind of work through that a bit.
Yeah. Okay, so in answering this question, the first thing I'm going to do is make myself vulnerable. I'm going to talk a little bit about my relationship to disability and mental difference. I have been given diagnoses by the mental health system that if I adopted the language and, embraced the way of thinking of the mental health system, I would see those conditions as pathologies. I live with mental difference, but I don't pathologize it. I try to stay away from that stigmatizing language and think about the ways that I experience the world psychologically as a difference and try to recuperate something valuable in that way of experiencing the world. So not ignoring the distress, sort of addressing the distress, but also investigating perhaps there's something in this way of being in the world that has value or that could have value. I see myself as occupying a kind of liminal position between disability and ability because I don't experience the same kind of unrelenting ableism and barriers to inclusion that some folks who I work with who have physical disabilities experience. So vulnerability becomes really important in working with people who have more visible disabilities. And it's also, I think, in the storytelling work that we do, where people from majority communities come together with minoritized people, vulnerability becomes an important site or condition of possibility for exchange to happen. Because historically, in institutions, whether we're talking about education institutions or we're talking about healthcare institutions, part of the ways that experts, so-called experts, have maintained their expertise and their power and their status is by not making themselves vulnerable. Invulnerability has served power. And I would argue that vulnerability is absolutely necessary to human being and human growth and development. We need vulnerability in order to establish relationships with each other. So vulnerability is the ground of human exchange and a way that we can come to know each other through difference. We can't come to know anything about difference if we don't make ourselves vulnerable.
It strikes me, too, that vulnerability is sort of imperative to art.
Yeah. So in order to put anything new into the world, we have to go to those scary places. We have to go to those places that are at the edges of what we know. We have to go to those places that do not yet have language. They're not safe places. Those are places of risk. And those are highly vulnerable places.
As, someone who I work in creative fields, and I'm, a content producer in podcast, and I was just thinking how do I make what I do more accessible? How do I approach that question, and how do I think through what that means? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how people who are making things in the world, how can we approach this and be part of creating more accessible worlds?
It's thinking about accessibility from an aesthetic perspective. So not thinking about accessibility as taking away from the production, but rather thinking about accessibility as adding another layer and another dimension that enriches the art that's created. There's lots of examples from people who are pushing at the boundaries of disability art. So that's why I run a big grant called Bodies in Translation that I co-direct with Dr. Eliza Chandler, who's a professor at Ryerson, and she is a disability art scholar. And we called our grant Bodies in Translation because not only are disability-identified artists working to translate their experience of disability through their art, but accessibility and making art accessible is very much about translating certain sensory experiences into other senses. And how do we do that translation in ways that are artful?
As someone who has little personal experience with difference and disability, this episode has been one of my most transformative learning experiences, and I hope it sparks something for you too, an opening in the way you see the world, or maybe a seed for learning more. And even for those who are really well versed in this area, I feel like we're in this extraordinary moment in our world where these concepts have taken on even more pressing relevance. Right now, we are imagining how things could be different. How instead of just, quote, getting back to normal, we might reimagine how we design, make, present, and share things. And not only how we make things, but who we make them for. And most importantly, who gets to be makers. As Dr. Rice and her co-authors put it, we can work to, quote, create new pathways for speaking back to the oppressive narratives that structure our lives. This moment of uncertainty is also a space of great opportunity. What if we all integrated accessibility practices into everything we did going forward? That could reshape our world not only for disability-identified folks, but also for other marginalized groups and voices. And making things accessible can be more than just a utilitarian or a required exercise. It can be beautiful and artful and transformative too.
Do you build a relationship with your prosthetics? What does that feel like?
What a question. That is, that's great. Wow. So, yes, definitely. It changes, and it has changed a lot. I've been through many sets of legs. And so I would say the first 2 years was really intense. And then that's shifted to the point that they really feel like an extension of my body. And then also, I don't know, the way that everything happened, it was so intense, and I came so close to dying, and it was just so down. And then it was I don't know, it was I just got pushed into fully accepting it and just turning it completely around. And I mean, I never would have imagined that, but I wouldn't go back if I could. I just feel like this is who I am now, and it's connected me to a lot of people. It's given me amazing experiences. It's been really hard, and there are ups and downs, but waking up in the morning now, I'm okay, this is what it is. Yeah.
This has been Hyacinth Podcast. Thank you to my guests, Erin Ball, Vanessa Furlong, and Dr. Carla Rice. For a transcript of this episode, links to videos of Legacy Circus performances, and information on Dr. Rice's projects Revision and Bodies in Translation, visit hyacinthpodcast.com. Follow at Hyacinth Podcast on social media and subscribe to Hyacinth Podcast on your favorite streaming app. Ratings and reviews really make an impact for independent podcasts like this one, so if you have a second, let everyone know what you think of this show. I hope you're staying safe and well and taking care of each other. I'm Carmel Michael. Thank you for listening, and talk real soon.